let's a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who were not here last week, are joining us for the first time tonight. We are obviously studying one of the great spiritual classics in Catholic literature, the Introduction to the Devout Life, by an author who we have some familiarity with in Holland because there is a parish on the south side of Holland named for him. Some of you have attended there. But last week we began the class by playing a video from a guy, French guy, taught us how to say the name of this author. And does anyone, we all remember how the correct way to pronounce it? Francis de Sales. But he said if you're in English, you can say Francis de Sales. But we said last week, that's a little bit like saying, oh, this summer for my vacation, I went to Paris, Nate Croissant. And so if it's okay if you say Francis de Sales, but it's not really Francis de Sales, just Francis de Sales. And we said last week that there's I don't think it's irony or coincidence. I think it's a little bit of sense of humor, I hope, that when the parish on the south side was founded, of all of the saints, the 10,000 canonized saints in the Catholic Church, they chose Francis de Sales, who was, do you all remember where he was the bishop of? Geneva, during the height of Calvin's reign in Geneva and Calvinism. And he was the person the Catholic Church sent to sort of counter Calvinism. And of course, this town was founded by Albertus Duralti and his merry band of Calvinists. And so the Catholic Church here had maybe a little bit of sense of humor about naming Francis de Sales as the patron saint, because Francis de Sales was the saint who responded to Calvinism. Do you remember how he responded to it? He was a prolific writer, yes. And we said that in his day, the big technology at that time was the printing press had been around for about 100 years, but one of the most popular ways to reach people was by printing these short pamphlets, short booklets that would be circulated. And he wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of them, such that he is the patron saint of journalists, right, and writers. And I made the point last week that if he were around today, he might be a podcaster, because it was a quick way a couple times a week to get messages out to people, and he was so effective at that. So, yeah.
Do any of those pamphlets remain? Do we still have examples?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an academic thing, but there are collections of his works. But as we said last week, what's fascinating about this book, and the reason we called the class Letters from a Saint, is that it was not written as a book. And initially, that he had a niece. Now, first of all, remember, he was a nobleman. He was raised to be like a count or a duke, the nobleman of a duchy or whatever, just down the road from Geneva. So that was his home area. And he was raised in a castle. He was educated in all the things that a nobleman would be educated in. Obviously law and rhetoric, but things like fencing and dancing and all of these things. And he was actually called, one of his nicknames is the gentleman's saint, or the nobleman's saint. And yet he went into the church, and the Pope sent him back to here to do what he did. But he had a niece who was a young woman, obviously, who was going to Paris, for finishing school, where a young woman would go and learn how to be an aristocrat, right? And so she was doing that. And while she was in Paris, hobnobbing with the aristocratic society, she wanted to be a devout Christian. And so he began to write her a series of letters to his niece, and just advising her on how to cultivate her spiritual life. And she eventually showed some of these letters to her confessor in Paris, who said, wow, these are great. And he showed them to some people, and somebody else showed them to people. And someone said, we should gather all these letters together and publish them as a book. And the book was a huge bestseller in the day, the early 1600s. It was incredibly popular. As I said last week, this was contemporaneous with Shakespeare in England on the same time that Shakespeare is publishing his plays. And just as Shakespeare was extremely popular, obviously in England and on the continent, this particular book, these collection of letters, became enormously popular, not only in France and the Low Countries, in Italy and England and Austria. It became an international bestseller. And in some ways, he was as well known as Shakespeare for this book. And it really is a foundational, I think, treatise, if that's the right word, because it's not academic, it's very practical, a foundational book on Catholic devotion and living the devout life, and how to put your Catholic faith into practice and to get the most out of it. And it became so incredibly popular that what's interesting to me is that there are so many books out today, so many pamphlets, so many books, we can go to the bookstore and find them all, that build on the foundation of the things that Francis de Sales, that he wrote in this. And many of his ideas, have been unpacked. And we're going to see a little bit of that tonight when he starts talking about confession, mortal and venial sin, how to cultivate that. And, you just think about how many popular Catholic authors today are continuing to sort of unpack and expand on the ideas that he made in this book. So it really was a foundational kind of book, one of the first real practical treatises on the spiritual life. There had been great Catholic works that were really aimed at the religious life, the avowed religious, so you can go back to St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and all these books, but they're writing stuff, about, heroic spiritual gymnastics for the kinds of people who are living in monasteries and convents. And Francis de Sales writes something that is very practical for the average person to live out their Catholic faith. So with that being said, why don't we open with a word of prayer? We'll begin with an Our Father tonight. You pray with me. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So who can quickly summarize for me kind of a little bit what we talked about last week? Anybody, what do you remember from the chapters that we looked at last week?
I remember one thing sticks out a little bit, how apparently it's pretty easy to get started down a path that probably gets wider and takes you further away from the truth. And it's easy to get misguided, maybe. Yep.
Yeah, good point. Tom's saying you can start on the wrong path. In fact, he talks about how with any endeavor, anything that you're going to do, if you sort of start it wrong, it just gets worse. It compounds. And so we gave some, kind of homely examples last week. We said, if you're going to tile your bathroom or wallpaper your house and you start the first row crooked, by the time you get back around, anybody ever done that? And then by the time you get back around to the other wall, it's all goofed up. And so then each row that you do just gets further and further and further off. And so he says, hey, in the same way, if you're going to pursue the devout life, you have to begin it correctly, or at least begin on the right path. And then, your efforts build on each other. Who remembers how he defined what devotion is? Because this book is all about devotion. He says the devout life is living a life of devotion. What is devotion? True love of God. And he defines that as your orientation. And that's going to be really relevant when we look at the passages tonight. What are you oriented toward? What are you pointed toward? Because, right, if you're pointed a little bit, we talk about, if I'm going to sail across Lake Michigan and I set a heading that I want to hit, go 270 degrees bearing due west, but I'm going 271. By the time I get on the other side of Lake Michigan, I'm a mile off, right? But then if I go to the Pacific Ocean, I leave Los Angeles or San Francisco on the West Coast, and I'm going to try to sail to Japan. If I'm 1 degree off, I'm going to miss Japan entirely. So if you start, right, a little bit off, if your devotion, your love of God is not aimed really at God, the further you go in your spiritual life, the further you go in life, the further away you'll get. It never gets right. So, he says, if you're going in the wrong direction, you don't keep going in the wrong direction. You hit the reset button. You kind of go back and reorient. And he says you have to kind of constantly be reorienting yourself so you're pointing towards God. And that's true love, when you love him first. Anything else that you remember from last week? Yeah.
So you can be in any state in life, whether you're a religious or ordained or worker or an artist or whatever it may be, and still achieve what God has in store for you for your life.
Excellent point, Mark. He says, look, whatever station or vocation you have in life, you can still achieve the devout life. But he kind of goes a little further than that, right? He says the devout life might look a little bit different. He says, if you're a priest or a bishop or a nun, or you're a mechanic or you're a housewife or you're a sailor or whatever it is. He said the trick is not for all of us to try to replicate the devout life. And I think this is a really important point, because a lot of us look at whether it's this or say we look at other parts of our life and we say, well, we want to model ourselves off our heroes. And I see that, when I came into the Catholic Church, I see, a lot of writing and things and very correctly saying, hey, look, here are these great saints. We have 10,000 canonized saints approximately in the Catholic Church over 2,000 years. And we can pick these amazing saints and go, I want to be like him or her. But the reality is most of us are not in a vocation or station in life where we're going to replicate the practices of that person. Most of us are not. If you're looking at somebody who is avowed religious, took vows of chastity and of celibacy and poverty and obedience, and lives in a monastery or convent, or is a mendicant friar, most of us can't do that because we have a job or we have a family or this, that. So DeSales says, look, you're going to live out the devout life within your vocation, and it's going to look appropriate to your station. So don't beat yourself up if you can't do what Francis of Assisi did, or Teresa of Avila did, or whatever. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I think you're mirroring Matthew Kelly when he advocates for being the best version of yourself.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, be the best version of yourself. If you think of it, what does it look? What he says is what does it look like to totally love God in my vocation, in my station, in the place of life that I'm in? What does that look like? That's the question we should be asking. And every one of us has a favorite saint that we'd love to model our life after, right? We all have our heroes and our spiritual heroes. Again, whether it's Saint Francis of Assisi or Saint, this or that, or whoever. What's his name? The saint who could fly. Oh, somebody help me out. What's that? Not Padre Pio could bilocate. I tell Father Michael all the time that his next goal is bilocation. He needs to bilocate like Padre Pio, because he always needs to be in 2 meetings at one time. And I'm like, your next challenge, Father, is bilocation. But the reality is most of us aren't going to fly or bilocate. Okay. Yeah, there's stories about different people who did that. There's one though. Oh my gosh, it's going to come to me in a minute. He was a monk, and he almost got kicked out of the monastery. They didn't accept the monastery because they thought he wasn't very intelligent and clever. They made him sweep the monastery and work in the kitchen. But anyway, point is, right, not all of us are going to be able to do some of these things. The question is, what does it look like to totally love God in my station in life, where God has planted me? Okay. All right. So now let's turn. Now I want to turn to tonight's passages with that kind of a little bit of a refresher. But I want to come back to a question that a couple of people asked last week to kind of set up tonight. I know, Tom, you asked this, and a couple other people did the same thing. What if, I'm however old I am, and I feel like, maybe I'm not on the right track. Maybe I didn't start my spiritual life, on the right track. I'm off. And how do I get on the right track at this point in my life? For whatever reason, maybe I didn't, start doing it the way that I should have done it. Or maybe things in my life have come up and, caused me to drift off course. How do I get on track? And that's what we're going to look at tonight, because he addresses that, because he knows as he's writing to his niece and everybody else that people are going to go, oh my goodness, what do I do? How do I get this thing pointed in the right direction? And so that's what we're going to look at tonight, is how do we get pointed in the right direction? And I want to stress that he says that this is something we may periodically have to do, right? Just like you may be, following a diet and fitness plan or a financial plan, and things are going really well for several years, but then you kind of get off your plan and now you're not eating right or exercising or managing your money the way you should, or whatever the case may be. And you go, man, I need to hit the reset button. And he says, that's just life, that's going to happen to us. So he says, when that happens, we need to prune and purify. Okay. So with that being said, now let's look at these passages that I've highlighted. I've just plucked these out of these chapters, a few of these, and we'll kind of read through these and discuss. And again, this is not so much of a lecture as a conversation a little bit tonight. So what I want to do is kind of read these passages a little bit, but you jump in and we'll talk about them. So this is chapter 5, again, part 1 of the book and the thing, but chapter 5 here. And he says the first step in pursuing true devotion, then, or resetting, is purifying the soul. So let's read this if you've got the handout. He says the time for pruning and cutting is come. And I've redacted this a little bit, because he talks about if you're growing flowers in your garden, whatever, that as the blooms start to come in, what do? You prune away other things. Because what happens if you have too many blooms growing on a rose bush, or some kind of too many pieces of fruit coming off the thing? What will happen? When the plant has only so much energy, right? The plant can only suck up so much sunlight and water. So if you have, say, for example, like growing a rose bush or something, and you have too many buds on it, what will happen is you'll have lots of small roses instead of a few big roses, right? So what you do is you start seeing it grow, and then you take your pruning knife and you prune away some of them. So you look at which are the strongest and the best, and you remove the weakest. And that way, all of the plant's resources are then going to the few. And you'd rather have 4 or 5 really nice roses on the plant than 10 or 15 tiny ones, right? So he says, the time for pruning and cutting is come. And what, my child, are our heart's flowers, save our good desires? So he says, our hearts bring forth, we do have good desires in our hearts. Those are the flowers of God that are trying to grow. He says, now, so as soon as these begin to appear, we need the pruning hook to cut off all dead and superfluous works from our conscience. In the same way you cut off the dead fruit or the dead blooms so the healthy ones can grow, we have to look at the dead and superfluous works in our life and cut those away, the weak things, the things that aren't growing, the things that aren't useful or helpful. We must pare and shave away every impediment which can hinder the love of God. So those things are going to suck, just like I give the analogy of the plant, those things are going to suck the energy away from us or out of us, so that the good things can't get all of the energy in our life and grow to full bloom. The very first step towards spiritual health is to be purged from our sinful humors. That's not a word we use a lot now, but it was a word that was very popular in that time. Humors are the essences. They had a notion that in our body are these humors, these energies, and so he's saying that our body has certain energies, or as a body has certain energies, so our spirit has certain energies, and those, the good, we want to cultivate the good ones, and we want to cut away the bad ones, right? And he gives an example. He says, St. Paul received perfect purification instantaneously. What's he talking about there? When he got knocked off a horse, right? When did he get knocked off a horse?
When he was converted.
On the, where was he? On the road to Damascus. And Jesus shows up, blinding light, knocks Paul off the horse. And Paul has this dramatic conversion. He goes from being, Saul, the persecutor of the Christians, right? And he has this dramatic, instantaneous conversion to Christ. But he says, and some others, and I redacted out the part where he lists some other great saints who had these instantaneous conversions. But this kind of purgation is as miraculous and extraordinary in grace as the resurrection of the dead in nature, nor do we dare venture to aspire to it. The ordinary purification, for ordinary people like us, most of us aren't going to be St. Paul or St. Francis of Assisi who has this dramatic conversion. He says the ordinary purification, whether of body or soul, is only accomplished by what? Slow degrees, step by step, gradually and painfully. So God, for most of us, for 99% of us, we're not going to have this dramatic getting knocked off our horse on the road to Damascus moment where our life goes from, black to white, from sin to saint, sinner to saint. That's not the way it works in ordinary people's lives. And, I think that's one of the things that I think it's so inspiring to read stories of biblical heroes or stories of great heroes of the faith and saints and all this stuff. But a lot of times that's a little bit intimidating for ordinary people because most of us can't do that. It's like, okay, like I like to golf, right? And one of my complaints about golf is that when we watch golf tournaments on TV, we're watching, the 200 best, the 100 best players in the world hit shots. And we watch this and go, oh, I'm going to go out on Saturday with my buddies and I'm going to hit the ball like that. And the truth is there's no way I will ever hit the ball like that, right? Like I had to come to accept at a certain point in my life that I will never slam dunk a basketball. Like my vertical jump is like this high and it will never happen. I could win the lottery. I could devote myself as a full-time job to working on dunking a basketball. I could hire a coach and a fitness thing, and I will never dunk a basketball, right? That's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that I can't accomplish things in life or be useful. And what DeSales is saying here is, for most of us, it's an incremental process, okay? Purification of our soul, pruning of these things is going to be a gradual, step-by-step thing. Sometimes we're going to take 2 steps forward and slide back 1, and have to re-encourage ourselves. And he's saying, again, that's why the book is so great, because he's talking practically, don't beat yourself up over it. Just keep making progress, right? Yeah.
Notice he does say, and painfully.
And painfully, yeah. Because it isn't doing anything in life that's worth doing hard, right? Is there anything in life sort of worth accomplishing that doesn't take effort and sometimes painful? Sometimes it's going to be painful moments. It's going to be things you're going to have to put effort and work into being good at anything. I don't care whether it's being being good at cooking or working on your fitness or your finances or being a good parent or growing a business or being a pastor or your spiritual life. It's going to take work and effort and patience and perseverance.
It kind of depends on what God has told each of us to.
Yeah.
I think today, like St. Paul, St. Catherine, Sienna, and some of those, like Mother Teresa, they were called to certain things.
Right.
And God also created them to have a certain personality.
Yeah.
Which is very forceful.
Yeah.
Very steely and couldn't be deviated too much because they knew what they were called to do.
Yeah.
So they had to have that dramatic conversion.
Yeah.
Whereas most of us, it's where we're called to be.
Right.
And the slow cooking maybe is harder to bear than just get it over with.
Yeah.
But
Well, Marilyn, for those of you who can't hear online, Marilyn made an excellent point about, it's all about where God has called us to be and serve in life. And in some sense, the story is written for us. For St. Paul or St. Catherine of Siena or Thomas Aquinas, or pick, St. Francis of Assisi, or whoever, pick your kind of, favorite saint. But all of these people were called to an extraordinary path, and God gave them the personality, the gifts, the strengths, the whatever. God never calls us to do something he's not going to equip us to do. Okay. I don't believe that God is ever going to call you to do something he isn't going to equip you to be able to accomplish. And so again, I think his point here is, don't beat yourself up by comparing yourself to someone you're not. God has a plan for you to grow where you are with your gifts, but you got to persevere in it. So look what he says. He says, it is a woeful thing, in the second paragraph here, to see souls beginning to chafe and grow disheartened because they find themselves still subject to imperfection after having made some attempt at leading a devout life, and well nigh yielding to the temptation to give up in despair and fall back. Who can relate to that? Who can relate to saying, I started out, I tried it, I got so enthusiastic, I made all of these efforts to do it, but I start to chafe and get discouraged and frustrated because I'm not making progress. And I see these imperfections myself, I'm not getting any better. Again, take whatever analogy you want to take, I mean, I've been playing golf for all these years, and I take lessons and I do all this stuff, and I bought a brand new driver and I'm not any better. And, there's times, right, where I'm going to throw my clubs in the lake and never do this again, right? But you could apply that to a lot of things in your life where you get discouraged because you don't seem to be making progress and getting better, and you're chafing and frustrated. And then he says what a woeful thing is to see souls beginning to do that and wanting to give up in despair. And again, you could relate that to ordinary things in life, but in the spiritual life. Now, a lot of you are, were raised in the church, or cradle Catholics or whatever, so you kind of always were in here. For some of us who were converts, right, we came in with all this enthusiasm at some point in our adult life, right? And we were like going to do all this stuff. I remember when I entered the Catholic Church, I was so enthusiastic, and I bought, 1,000 new books, and I did this and I did that, and I was going to do the Liturgy of the Hours from day one, and I was going to do 3 rosaries a day, and I set my phone up to do the Angelus 3 times a day. Actually, I downloaded this little bell thing and go ding, ding, ding. And like I was just going to do it all. Like I kind of went through the whole menu of all the things like you could do. And I wanted to be like super Catholic. And so I looked at every Catholic devotion, everything I could do. And I'm like, well, which one? I'm going to do it all. Right. And after a year or two, I go, oh God, I'm just failing. I can't keep up with that. I missed this, and I forgot to pray my rosary, and I was in a meeting and the bells went ding, ding, ding on my phone. I'm supposed to play the Angelus, and I'm like, and I'm at lunch at McDonald's, right? And so all these things, and you go, oh man, I'm failing, I'm frustrated. Now, at that point, right, you're tempted, he says, to do what? To give up. Right? And that's a character issue, isn't it, in our lives? At that point, you can go, oh man, I just can't do this. I'm just going to give up, right? But that's where the character of perseverance comes in. And we say, okay, don't beat myself up, fall back a little bit, get reoriented, and do what you can do and grow, he says, gradually by measures. Yeah.
I think of this in relation to my own children.
Sure.
Are falling away, but I think it's important to point out, just keep showing up.
Yeah.
Even if you don't get it, you just keep, it goes hand in hand with the perseverance, but the attending mass is the one that comes to mind all the time.
Yep.
With kids, is that I'm gonna be out of it, boring, and I think it's important to emphasize, just keep showing up. By some grace,
Absolutely. Charlotte says, you got to keep showing up. I can't remember who said it, but famous line of 90% of success is just showing up. I mean, in any field, in any endeavor in life, you just keep showing up. You just come back the next day and try again. And the thing is, he says, some souls start off with a bang, and super enthusiastic, get frustrated, chafe, frustrated, this and that, and they just fizzle out. But then look what he says. He says, but on the other hand, there's an extreme danger surrounding those souls who, through the opposite temptation, are disposed to imagine themselves purified from all imperfections at the very outset of their purgation. What's he talking about here? He's saying there's a different thing. There's the person who goes, I'm frustrated because I'm not getting any better. I'm not growing in my devotion and in my devout life. But he says another one, and that's the one who fools themselves in thinking that they're doing great, so great. He says, like, right, some people from the beginning, like, yeah, this is easy, man. I got the easy button on this. I'm doing fantastic. I am so devout, you know. I am really, really devout. I've been at this Catholic thing for like, 3 weeks, and I'm rocking it. Right? I've been at this God thing for a month, and I'm just crushing it. Yeah, but he's saying, right, some of these people right out of the gate, like look at this, we're in the middle of the second paragraph. Extreme danger, disposed to imagine themselves purified from all the imperfections at the very outset of their purgation, who count themselves as full grown almost before they are born, and seek to fly before they have wings. Be sure, daughter, that these are in great danger of a relapse through having left their physician too soon. This is a thing about how in the church, and I started working full-time, or I started working professionally in churches 38 years ago. And when I was 24 years old. And, one of the things that I've learned over the years about myself, but also about others, is the danger of putting people into positions of trust and leadership too soon. Because you're going to meet these people. They're converts to Christianity or converts to Catholicism, they're newcomers to your church, and they're right out of the gate. I've been at this, for 10 whole months, and I'm crushing it. And then they maybe have some gifts. They're super intelligent, they're super capable, and then what you go is oh man, this person would be perfect on my finance council, or this person would be a perfect catechist, or I should put this person on my, my elder board, or I should do this or that. And all of a sudden you realize, exactly what he's saying. This is a person who imagines themselves as full grown before they're even, out of the nursery. And the thing is, they attempt to fly before they really have wings. Those little baby birds don't leave the nest. If they jump out of the nest too soon, they do what? They plummet like stones, right? You have to cultivate that. And he says, that's a whole nother danger. So what he's saying is there's two kinds of ways you can go. One is the person who just plugs away and gets frustrated because they're not going fast enough. And the other person is a person who kind of is almost going too fast in the cultivation of their spiritual life, such that they sort of run out ahead of themselves. And he says, these are both dangers. Look what he says then. He says, the work of the soul's perfection neither may nor can end save with life itself. What he's saying is, let me translate, that's an awkward sentence in English. What he says is, you're not going to get, your soul's not going to be purified. When your soul will be really purified? When you die. Right? Like, you're not going to achieve perfection, in this life. You're just not. You're gonna. When do I get there? You don't. You really kind of don't. And I think two kind of, not jokes, but right. Like, there's the whole thing of like guys at one end of the room, and at the other end of the room, there's like a treasure chest, and he hears this voice say, at the sound of, each the bell every, whatever hour, whatever, you can advance half the distance to the treasure chest. Well, when will he get there? You never get there. You always, right? Or the other one is an old joke. We used to have our, my old Protestant days, people would come and say, I want to find the perfect church. And you know how you find the perfect church? Die. I want to join the perfect church. Die. That's where you'll find the perfect church, right? You know what I'm saying? So the thing is, he says, like, all of these things, you're not, this is a lifelong process. He says, so do not then let us be disheartened by our imperfections, Our very perfection lies in diligently contending against them. And it is impossible so to contend without seeing them or overcome them without meeting them face to face. Our victory does not consist in being insensible to them, in other words, not being aware of them, but in not consenting to them. What's he saying there? What's the difference? He's saying that our victory is not becoming, getting rid of all the imperfections in us. Our victory is not being satisfied and consenting to those imperfections, not becoming content with them. Do you see the difference? I'm never gonna, in this life, completely purge myself of all sin, of all imperfections. But the danger lies when I don't care anymore. I consent to them. I no longer contend with them. I'm okay with them. And this is the great spiritual danger, is when we become okay with the imperfections of life. And this is, by the way, the great danger, I think, of our postmodern world and our postmodern Christianity. Okay, so for thousands of years, Catholicism said things like this, right? The road to heaven is a long, hard road, right? What does Jesus say? The road to hell is what? Broad and wide. The road to heaven is a narrow, long, climb, right? But we, in the modern world, what is the modern gospel? It's okay, right? Like, yeah, you're not perfect. You got this, you got that, you got these imperfections in you, you got these sins in you, it's about being okay with yourself. That's the modern gospel. And God's cool with you as you are. And there's a sense in which that's true, right? I mean, God loves you. But the thing is when you get to the point you go, yeah, I'm basically good as I am. Now, do you see the difference between saying, right, not beating yourself up because you're imperfect, but also not going, I'm not content with the imperfections in my life. I can still see in myself things that need to grow and change. And when you talk about these great saints, and they in their writings, and they talk about themselves, they talk about how, I've often wondered when you hear about these great saints, like I was reading a book about Padre Pio, and it's like he's going to confession and all that. It's an old man. I'm like, what is Padre Pio going in and confessing? Like, none of my business, but it's like, oh, I'm really, or Mother Teresa, many years after she passed, they published some of her journals, and she was very, looked in her own heart and said, I just see like all this stuff in my own heart that's not good. Okay, you're Mother Teresa. But then you meet, your average person, your neighbor or myself, who goes, yeah, I think I'm good. I actually had lunch, say whatever. This is a couple of years ago. I had lunch with a Catholic man, cradle Catholic guy, and we just went out and had lunch or whatever. And he's like, I kind of look at my life, what I've done in my career, my kids, and my this and my that, and I think I'm pretty good. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He goes, I'm pretty good. I'm good. And I go, well, I mean, do you go to mass often? Not that much. And I'm not that involved, but I don't think I need it. He actually said that to me at lunch. I mean, it's good, try to get when I can and do this and that. But honestly, I think I'm pretty good. I think I did a pretty good job. I think I'm pretty good. And I'm like, this is the problem. I don't want to, right? I'm not saying he's a bad person.
Not going hand in hand with being comfortable.
Yeah.
Complacency and.
Yeah, complacency and overly comfort. And that's what he's warning us against, right? And so he says here, and I want to just kind of finish this little quote because it's really great. Our victory does not consist in being insensible to them, but in not consenting to them. Moreover, imperfections and venial sins cannot destroy our spiritual life, which is only to be lost through mortal sin. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. I got to move on to that. The distinction between mortal and venial. He says all these little imperfections, if they're venial things, they're not going to doom you to hell, right? But he says, consequently, we need to watch well that they do not imperil our courage. So he's talking here not about mortal sins. I want to, murder a guy last night. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about your short temper. He's talking about your, greediness, your incharity to your neighbor, your this, your that, right? All those little things that you don't want to, right? That eat away at you, that keep you from being the person God, that you want to be, that God wants you to be. And if you become content with that, like, I'm good, I'm okay, right? He says, what at a certain point, they imperil our courage because we no longer fight against them. And that's what he says. We have to continue to strive. All right, let's move on to this. And now I want to introduce, he introduces a little bit of discussion between the difference between purifying or purging ourselves from mortal sin versus venial sin. Okay, everybody know the difference between mortal and venial, right? So mortal sin being by definition, those things that ultimately separate you from God, right? Venial sin being those imperfections that keep you from being all, and this is a crude way to put it, but keep you from being all that God wants you to be. Make sense? So he talks about this. So now we're looking at chapter 6, first purification of mortal sin. The first purification is to be made is from sin. That means whereby to make it the sacrament of penance. So let me just, catch this out for you. What he says is, what's the only way to purge yourself from mortal sin? What he calls the sacrament of penance. We now call it the sacrament of reconciliation in contemporary American church, right? But used to be called the sacrament of penance. But he says, you got to go to confession. That's the remedy. There's some other remedy, right? If you went out last night and knocked off a liquor store and killed a guy, it isn't like you're gonna well, I'm gonna pray a couple of rosaries and and I'll be good, right? You've got to do what? You've got to have absolution. So he says, you've got to do this. And now he gives advice about the sacrament of penance to his niece. He says, seek the best confessor within your reach. Now, how many of us, we've gone to different priests, and how many of us will say, well, how many can relate that some confessors are sort of better than other confessors, right? In different ways, right? Some, you can kind of confession shop. You can know that there are certain priests around that they're pretty easy. They're you go in there and you say this, well, okay, sure, that's good. Do your best. Try harder next time. You're good. Go out and, say a couple Hail Marys and you're good. See you in a month, right? And then there's some that are going to probe a little harder and a little deeper, right? And depending on your definition of a good or bad confessor. But he says, you want a good confessor, because what's a good confessor really going to do? Not just beat you up in the confessional and not just give you an easy pass, but do what? Get to the heart of the issue, right? A good confessor is going to be, in persona Christi, acting like the great physician in your life. And he says, seek the best confessor within your reach. Use one of the many little books written in order to help with the examination of conscience. So even in 1600 or 1608 or whenever this was, there were many little books that you could get that were guides to confession, right? How many of us have a bunch of little books like that, or apps on your phone or whatever? I've got 4 little confession apps on my phone, plus books in my library or whatever. And, he says, find one that works for you, that helps you make a good examination of conscience. Read some such book carefully, examining point by point wherein you have sinned, from the first use of your reason to the present time. Now, what he's going to be talking about here is a general confession of life. He's not talking about the confession you go to once a week or once a month or, whatever. He's talking about this hard reset in your life. Where you go, I've been on the wrong path for a long time. And this isn't just like my monthly drop into so 30 days since my last confession, I, did this and I did this and I did this. And it's okay, well, all right, I'm out in the confessional 2 minutes. He's saying there's sometimes you need to do a hard reset. And you need to kind of go back and say, hey, Father, I really kind of want to do a deep examination of my life. Maybe I've been kind of on the wrong track for a while, right? He says, and if you mistrust your memory, write down the result of your examination. So I don't know how you do that, where you maybe take notes when you're doing your examination of conscience, and you've got a little notebook, or you have your notes app on your phone, maybe with a password protected notes app or whatever, but you go in there and you just keep, your notes. I'll share a little bit about my own habit. I have in my notes app on my phone, I have a section, a folder where it's password protected, And so anyway, I have in there my confession because it seems like all the issues in my life just keep coming up. I copy and paste from the last confession. So I opened up my last confession notes and copy and paste it and go, okay, well, yeah, okay, that one, all right, did better this time. I got to add one and a couple of them I can take off, but pretty much it always seems to kind of fall back to some of the same issues because that's who I am. And you know who you are. The shape of who we are. Can I give you a great analogy? When I was worked at Zondervan, we had a very well-known Christian author that I worked with, and he was a friend of mine. And he had what I think is one of the all-time great metaphors for this. He said, we a lot of times talk about spiritual growth and improvement as a journey from point A to point B. So he says we talk about peaks and valleys. We go over these hills, down a valley, and up another thing, right? He goes, I don't like that analogy. He goes, I think that spiritual growth is more like you're a mountain and there's a trail that goes around the mountain, like keeps making laps around the mountain. And the mountain has characteristics to it. So it's got like a ridge over on the north side and it's kind of valley on the east side, right? And so it has a sort of shape. And he said that as the years go by, you keep going around the same mountain, passing the same features, but hopefully every year you're passing it a little higher than you did last time, right? And so you go, oh, here's that thing in my life again. But hopefully this year, it's a little better than it was last year and the year before. But the shape of who I am, the shape of the things that are the flaws and imperfections in me are probably all going to be the same. My imperfections and flaws are going to be different than yours and yours and yours. But all of us have those. And part of that examinative conscience and knowing ourselves well is knowing those are the places that the imperfections lie in us. Okay? So he says to her, go get it, do a good confession, do this, and then look at the part where I bold-faced in the middle. He said, you see, my child, that I am now speaking of a general confession of your whole life, which, while I grant is not always necessary. You don't need to go in every month and say to Father, when there's 42 people in the chapel waiting in line, and you go, Father, I would like to start when I was 2 years old. And it's like, Father's going to go, come on, right? But he, these are the ones where he goes, it's not always necessary, but you make it a point in your life where you go, I need to make an appointment with Father because this is going to be longer than the normal 3-minute, 4-minute thing. And he said, I yet believe will be found most helpful in the beginning of your pursuit after holiness. So if you're going to do a hard reset and begin to really pursue the devout life, you may want to make an appointment with Father and do this, he says, general confession and say, hey, Father, I've been, I just really want to take a deep dive into the stuff in my life that's been an issue for a long time. And then skip down to the last part of that where I bold-faced on that paragraph. He says, therefore, I cannot enter into the subject of a general change of life, an entire turning to God by means of a devout life, without urging upon you to begin with a general confession. So somebody asked last week, well, what do we do? Well, St. Francis of Sales says, start with a general confession. Get one of these little books on examination of conscience, do a really deep dive into who you are and where the imperfections in your life lie. Make an appointment with the Father. Don't show up on Saturday when there's 27 people behind you in the chapel and want to do 45 minutes. And then when I was 14 years old, it's like, right? But he says, from time to time in your life, you may want to do that deep dive. And especially at the beginning of this pursuit of a devout life. Okay? Questions about that mortal sin and confession. Then we're going to move on to the venial sins, which he says are the things that for so many of us are the real issues. Because not many of us have gone out and not many of us went and knocked off a liquor store and murdered somebody last night. For a lot of us, it is all of these venial sins that keep us from becoming all we should be. But any questions about the mortal sin confession thing? Okay. So let's look at the next little paragraph here, chapter 7, the second purification from all sinful affectations. What's an affectation? An old style word. It's when you, affectations have to do with emotions. It's when you have a strong desire or attachment or love for something emotionally, strong emotional bond. So you don't have an affectation or affective, not effective, affective. So you have an emotional connection with something. All right. And so he says the second purification is from all these sinful affectations in my life, all the things that I'm really attached to, that I really love, that I'm really drawn to. And this is, I can't wait to get into this because this is super powerful. This is where this book is worth the price of buying the book. Okay. Now, I love this next passage. So just bear with me because I'm going to read this because this is gold. This is why this guy is the patron saint of writers and journalists. Okay. He says, all of the children of Israel went forth from the land of Egypt, but not all went forth heartily. Okay. So Moses says, we're all leaving, gather your stuff, right? And here we go. Now, did all of the whatever million Israelites who marched out that night, all right, on Passover, were they all enthusiastic? No. A lot of them weren't enthusiastic. Oh, they're going to go because the 10 plagues and the this and that, and we're leaving. But a lot of them were like, right? So what happened when they got out into the desert? They started moaning and complaining, right? Like kids on a car trip, right? Anybody ever taken kids on a long car trip? Anybody ever taken middle schoolers on a bus on a long trip? Okay. And they started whining and complaining almost from the first moment. They just, right? At Meribah and Massa, right? We just had that reading in Mass, and this weekend. And it was like, and there's no water, and there's no this, and there's no that. But he picks up a moment from when they got to the edge of the promised land. Do you remember that after wandering around in the desert, they finally get to the edge of the River Jordan, and they send 12 spies into the land. Okay? And the spies come back, and do you remember what the spies said? This is not a good thing, because the land of Canaan is full of people with all these fortified cities. And by the way, they're like giants, and they got armor and horses and chariots. Like, this is not empty, like, real estate. The place is populated with big, strong people, with big, strong cities, with big, strong militaries. If we cross over the river in time, they're going to slaughter us. Right? You remember 2 of the spies gave the minority report. Remember their names for a bonus? Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua, 2 of the spies said, yeah, they're big and strong, and they got armies, and they got all this stuff, but we got God on our side, right? But do you remember what the Israelites said when the spies gave their report? Most of them started moaning and complaining, and they said, we had a good gig back in Egypt. We ate leeks and onions. We had flesh pots. I always hate that translation of the word because there's connotations in English that are not good. We didn't have flesh pots like we had pots of flesh, right? Like we had cauldrons of stew. Let's put it that way. And back there, like there were leeks and onions and like we had stew every night with, goat meat in it. And it was we had to make bricks and we had to build the pyramids or whatever, right? That part wasn't so great. But at the end of the day, we did get 3 hots and a cot. And they go, now you brought us all the way out here in the middle of nowhere and we're going to get slaughtered. And you remember what they said to Moses? We want to go what? Let's go back to Egypt and see if the Pharaoh will give us our old jobs back. Better to go back there and be slaves in Egypt and get the leeks and the onions and the big cauldrons of stew every night, the 3 hots and a cot. Yeah, we had to drag some bricks around, but, it was a good job. It was secure. It was secure. Now we're out here in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to get slaughtered. So Francis Sales brings that incident up. Let's look at what he says about the spiritual life. He says, all the children of Israel went forth from the land of Egypt, not all of them went forth heartily. And so when wandering in the desert, some of them sighed after the leeks and onions, the flesh pots of Egypt. Even so, there are penitents who forsake sin, yet without forsaking their sinful affectations. So I have stopped doing the things I wasn't supposed to do, right? I've become, I've come into the church or whatever, and I know I'm not supposed to do X, Y, Z. Let's just pick some, thing. Like, I know I'm not supposed to do, I don't know, eat meat on Friday, or I'm not supposed to do online gambling and gamble away my mortgage every month or whatever, right? I know I'm not supposed to do that, okay? Or I'm not supposed to go to the bar every night and drink. I've stopped doing that, but I sure do miss it. And I think about it all the time. And I know I'm not supposed to go to the bar and drink my paycheck away, but man, I had some good times. And what he says is you've stopped the behavior, the action, but you still have the affectation, the love for the thing. In the same way, he says that the Israelites left Egypt, but they were thinking about the leeks and the onions and the stew, the flesh pots. Okay? So he says, there are penitents, they forsake sin. That is to say, they intend to sin no more, but it goes sorely against them to abstain from the pleasures of sin. They formally renounce and forsake sinful acts, but they turn back many a fond, lingering look to what they have left behind, like Lot's wife as she fled from Sodom. They are like a sick man. I love this. They're like a sick man who abstains from eating melon. Do sick men are not supposed to eat? Oh, okay. Apparently, in 1600, if you were sick, one of the things was, man, don't eat melon. Because, okay. So, all right. And he says, I know I'm sick. I'm not supposed to eat any melon when the doctor says it would kill him. Man, if you eat that melon, you're going to die, man. Do not eat any cantaloupes or honeydew melons. It'll finish you right off, right? He goes, but all the while I long for it. I talk about it. Our bargain. When can I eat melon? When can I have cantaloupe again? When can I do this? Oh, man, I would really like me some cantaloupe. And he's like, I know I can't have it. The doctor says, man, you can't have the cantaloupe because, man, the cantaloupe's going to like finish you off. It's like, okay. His wife's like, he said, could I have some cantaloupe? She goes, no, doc says you can't have any cantaloupe. You're gonna die. He goes, man, I just lay there and thinking, well, when could I have the cantaloupe? Could I have it next week? If I get a little bit better, could I have the cantaloupe? And he, right? So all he does is think about the cantaloupe, the melon, right? He says, but all the while longs for, talks about bargains where they met it, would at least like just to sniff it. Could you just bring me the cantaloupe and let me like look at it? Could I just sniff the cantaloupe? And his wife's like, well, no, and he's like, I know, I probably won't eat it. I just kind of like, right? And he says, and he thinks those who are free to eat it are very fortunate. So he's looking at his brother-in-law. He goes, man, you eat cantaloupe this morning? Yeah, man, I had a big, side of cantaloupe this morning. Oh man, you're so lucky, right? Lucky, right? And he says, so these weak, cowardly penitents abstain a while from sin, from doing the sinful actions, but reluctantly. They would fain be able to sin without incurring damnation. They talk with a lingering taste of their sinful deeds and envy those who are yet indulging in the like. I don't go to the bars anymore, but yeah, man, I sure miss the bars. I was talking to my buddy the other day, and he was telling me about what a good time they had at the bar the other night. I just drove past the bar on the way the other night home, and I was coming home from work the other night. I just drove past and just to look at it. And look, I get pictures of my phone of the bar right here, right? I'm on the bar's webcam, right? Right? He says, thus a man who has mediated some revenge, okay? So he's going, I'm going to get even with my neighbor. My neighbor keeps saying his dog come over and poop in my yard. I'm going to go like take the dog poop and put it on his porch and light it on fire, right? I'm going to get even with him, right? And he goes to confession. The priest says, do not take your neighbor's dog poop, put it in a bag and put it on his porch and light it. The priest says, don't do that. He goes, all right, Father, I promise I won't do that. But, right? But he says, right? Soon after, he's to be found talking about the quarrel. So he's telling his buddies at work, man, did I ever tell you about my neighbor who's like, yeah, dude, you tell me every day about your neighbor when the dog pooped. Give it up, right? He goes, so he cultivates this in his heart, right? He says, I mean, if God would just let me, I know I can't, but man, he's obsessed with it. He said, who can fail to see that even if this poor man is not actually committing sin, he is altogether bound with the affectations or the affections thereof. He's not committing the action, but he's in love with the thing, right? And although he may have come out of Egypt, he yet hungers after it and longs for the leeks and onions he was wont to feed on there. It is the same with the woman who, although she has given up her life of sin, yet takes delight in being sought after and admired. Alas, of a truth, all such are in great peril. Be sure, my daughter, that if you seek to lead a devout life, you must not merely forsake sinful actions, but you must further cleanse your heart from all affections pertaining to sin. For, to say nothing of the danger of a relapse, these wretched affections will perpetually enfeeble your mind and clog it, so that you will be unable to be diligent, ready, and frequent in good works, which nevertheless lies the very essence of all true devotion. So if you're sitting around like the guy wants the cantaloupe, or the guy who thinks about, man, if I could, man, if Father hadn't told me, I would totally go light dog poop on my neighbor's porch. I would totally do that if only I could. Or, right? Right? He says, don't you understand that not only are you probably going to, one of these days you're going to break down and do it anyway. But the other thing is, you can't think clearly and love God because your mind is still clogged up with this stuff and feebled. You're not diligent, ready, and frequent in your good works because you spend all of your time thinking about the leeks and onions and flesh pots. Now, I don't know about you, but this passage is worth the price of that book. Because I don't know about you, but I see myself in that. Don't you? Where's your heart? And I have, like, well, I'm sure we all do. I have some old buddies from high school and stuff, and every now and then we get to talking about some of the crazy things that we did in high school. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I did some really crazy stuff in high school. I mean, like epically. And so I get together with my friends, like, dude, do you remember what? Oh my, right? I'm going to give you a little sorry insight into my life. So, in golf league a number of years ago, my partner and I were like, we each need a safe word. What it was is if you saw your partner, either of us saw the other one about to do something really stupid, like, man, the green's only 220 over there across the pond. If I just carry 210 across this pond into this headwind, I can totally stick that green. And I think I can do it. And then what you would do is you'd say the safe word to like shake him up and go, dude, do not do this. This is a really bad idea. So I said, what's your safe word? And he go, tell me something that, like, as soon as I say it to you, will instantly make you think of a bad idea. Like, oh, that's a bad thing. I'll warn you off. And so he gave me a word. And he goes, what's your safe word? I said, Ensenada. Because if you say Ensenada to me, I'm going to go, bad idea. That just represents, the word Ensenada represents poor decision-making in my life. Okay? So I'm like, buddy, anytime you're about to see me make a poor decision, just say Ensenada. And I went, right? But see, this is the thing where when I get together with my high school buddies and we start talking about Ensenada, we start laughing about it and thinking about it and going, I know it was really bad, but man, it's super fun. And what he's saying is, right, there are things in our life that we no longer do because we have a certain level of maturity. We've stopped doing the thing, but we love that thing. And that's two dangers, right? Number one, we're going to do what? Eventually, you're going to relapse. Eventually, you're going to eat the melon. You're going to do the whatever. And the other thing is, as long as you love that thing, it still clogs your reasoning and your heart and your affections. And he says the only way that you're ever really going to purge that stuff out of your life is you can't just stop doing the thing. You have to stop loving the thing.
That's what they teach in fiction.
Yeah.
That's probably even more difficult than the physical action of stopping.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, stopping the thing is easier than, because like Charlotte just said, that you're an addiction. So, I know, I know people who've been through, 12 step, and they try to stop smoking and they go, yeah, I don't smoke much, but if I watch people smoking and I think about smoking and I look at them smoking and right. And, eventually this is going to just get you. So he's saying like my daughter, he's my daughter's niece, listen, or all of us, you can't just pat yourself on the back because you stop doing the thing, because you're never really going to grow in the devout life.
You have to stop wanting.
You have to stop wanting those things. Okay. So how do you stop wanting those things?
You start hating it.
You start hating it. Good. Thanks. Marilyn read it. Marilyn read the homework. Because the next thing on this sheet, right? Let's just go to the next paragraph. Because he says how to affect the second purification. Okay, so how do I pull that off? How do I stop loving the thing? He says, well, the first inducement to attain the second purification is a keen and lively apprehension of the great evils resulting from sin, by means of which we acquire a deep hearty contrition. So it's not enough just to say, I shouldn't do it. You have to really come to hate it and to be genuinely sorry for it. How many of us with our kids had to, or maybe with our own lives, had to introduce the distinction between regret and repentance? So how many of you, like your kid did something and you go, you did a bad thing, and they're like, yeah, and they regretted it. Why did they, what's the difference? They regretted it because why? Because they got in trouble. They regretted it. Did they repent? Did they really feel sorry for it? Did they hate it? Did they really get it? Like, this was a bad thing and I never want to do that again. It's like, I'm sorry I got caught. I regret doing that. It got me into trouble. That's different than genuine repentance. And so he says here, you have to have that genuine repentance, what he calls that deep hearty contrition, right? He says a moderate slight hatred makes men dislike its object and avoid his society, right? He says, so if you dislike something, like you just kind of mildly dislike it, there's something that you dislike that you generally avoid. Yeah, certain kinds of TV shows I don't like. Maybe there's maybe there's a person that, like, when I run into the person, like, I'm gonna just, like, you see him coming the other way down the grocery store aisle and you go, no, I'm gonna kind of just sort of avoid him, or, but if I really hate something, it's not this that I just kind of avoid it or blow it off. I really hate it, and I will do anything I can to never be around it, right? You got those things in your life? Things that you kind of dislike, maybe, but things that you really hate. And he says you have to really hate the sin. It's not enough just to dislike the sin. He says, just so when a penitent only hates sin through a weakly, although real contrition, yeah, I'm sorry for it, and I, it's not a good thing, and, I wish I hadn't done it, and I'm going to try to never do it again. He will resolve to avoid overt acts of sin, but when his contrition is strong and hearty, he will not merely abhor sin, but every affection, every link and tendency, right? And when I even see that stuff coming up inside of me, it makes me sick to think about it. Did you ever like eat a food, have a bad experience with something where like, you can never stand the taste or smell of that thing again because you got like maybe sick eating it once? I remember once I was like in high school or something, and we were at the beach or something, and I ate like Reese's peanut butter cups that had been sitting in the sun all day, and I like puked. And then it was like for 20 years, I could never look at a Reese's peanut butter cup. Like I would just like, you get like Halloween, they'd have them like for candy and little things. I'm like, right? It just like made me like sick to think about it. Eventually I got over it, but it took a really long time. But right, when you really, really hate that thing, like I just get it out of my sight. I don't want to see it. And he says, you're never really going to avoid the sin the way that you need to avoid it unless you have that kind of, inherent abhorrence to the thing. There's a lot of people, all of us, right, have things that we don't do anymore, but we don't really hate them. And so they're always kind of on the edge, and Satan will use them to work on you. Remind me at the end of the class tonight to tell you a story about that, about Satan and how it works. Chapter 13, the necessity of purging away all tendency to venial sins, right? Here he's talking about those venial sins. He says, look, as daylight waxes, what is wax? Gets bigger, wax and wane. So basically, as the sun is coming up, because he wrote this like before you'd have electric lights. So he goes, you're looking in the mirror in the morning, and as the sun comes up, you can do what? You can see yourself more clearly. And you can see all, like, my face is dirty, and you can see all the imperfections in your face, right? Even so, as the interior light of the Holy Spirit enlightens our conscience, we see more distinctly the sins, inclinations, and imperfections which hinder our progress towards real devotion. So as the Holy Spirit works in our life, we begin to be more honest with ourselves. We really see who we are and the imperfections us more clearly. He goes, and the self-same light which shows us these blots and stains kindles in us the desire to be cleansed and purged therefrom. You woke up in the morning and you go, man, my face is all broken out and zits and dirty and all this stuff. You go, oh God, I look heinous, right? Then you're going to want to, like, do whatever to fix it. But if the light is bad, you can go, I think I look okay, right? And he said, so as the Holy Spirit grows in your life, you have more clarity about who you are, and you can see those things, okay? You will then find, my child, that besides mortal sins and their affections from which your soul has already been purged, you are beset by, okay, stick with it here, by sundry inclinations and tendencies to venial sin. Mind, I do not say that you will find venial sins, but the inclination and tendency to them. Okay, we're always going to see the venial sins. I did this and I did that and I did that. He goes, but that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the things in you that make you do them in the first place. So he gives some examples. He says, now one is quite indifferent from the other. We can never be altogether free from venial sin, at least not until after a very long persistence in this purity. But we can be without any affection for venial sin. It is altogether one thing to have said something unimportant, not strictly true, right? So, right, we've all done this, right? Oh, well, I kind of told a little, what I said wasn't entirely accurate in that conversation, right? We've all done this. He says it's one thing to do that, which he says everybody does from time to time, out of carelessness or liveliness, because I'm blah, 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 blah. He says, and quite a different matter to take pleasure in lying and in the habitual practice thereof. So it's one thing to exaggerate how big the fish you caught was. It's one thing to maybe give yourself a couple mulligans on your golf card. It's another thing to sort of, blah, blah, blah. It's another thing to sort of develop this pattern of untruthfulness in yourself. Right? And he says, these inclinations, think about it, the inclination to be untruthful, right? What he's saying is there's going to be times, and you could say this about being untruthful, you could say about being angry, you could say about it being greedy, you could say about it being, using foul language, you could say about it, 10,000 things, whatever. He says there's a difference between the thing itself and the inclination to do the thing. And you have to sort of find those inclinations in yourself. I have a tendency to I have a temper. I personally don't. I don't have a very big temper. But, right, someone might say, I have a temper. And just things set me off and I go. And he goes, okay, so I'm really trying to control not, yelling at people or not, having road rage or giving people colorful gestures when they cut me off on the highway, right? It's one thing to not do those things. Another thing to go, I just know I have a tendency, the slightest thing just sort of pushes my buttons. And he says, these inclinations, my daughter, are in direct opposition to devotion, as inclinations to mortal sin are to love. They weaken the mental power. They hinder divine consolations, and they open the door to temptations. And although they do not destroy the soul, right? This is because they're venial sins. They do not destroy us mortally. They're things that, are worked off in purgatory. He says, at the very least, they bring on serious disease in our life. He says, I'm not talking about mortal sins. I'm talking about all those little things in your life that you do, those venial sins. But he goes, I'm going deeper. I'm talking about what is it in you? What are the character flaws? What are the personality traits? What are the things that are built into you by nature, just because of the personality you have, and also by nurture, how you were raised, the home you were raised in, whatever it is, right? And those inclinations, those tendencies are things you've got to start taking seriously. He says, though venial sins may not lose the soul, they will spoil its devotion. Venial sin won't send you to hell, but it will send you to purgatory, but it will just make it hard to really love God in this life because there's all this junk, all this clutter. And he says, so cumber its faculties with bad habits and evil inclinations, as to deprive it of all that cheerful readiness, which is the very essence of true devotion. If you have all this clutter in your heart, in your mind, in your personality, in your character, you can't really be devoted because there's all this clutter, all this junk. Not talking, he says, mortal sin. I'm just talking about all that junk that holds you back. So he says, a trifling inaccuracy, right? That's where you go, oh, well, yeah, it was, the fish was this big, or right? A trifling inaccuracy, a little hastiness in word or action, some small excess in mirth, in dress, in gaiety, may not be very important if these are forthwith heated and swept out as spiritual cobwebs in your life. But if they are permitted to linger in the heart, or worse still, if we take pleasure in them and indulge them, our honey will soon be spoilt, and the hive of our conscience will be cumbered and damaged. So it's not good enough just to stop doing those things. You've got to figure out where they're coming from in you. And you have to work on developing your character, your personality. You have to become, you have to treat this and go, just as you do in your physical life, you go, man, why do I have all these ailments, or your physical fitness or anything else? You go, what is it in me that keeps me doing these things? And am I gonna, whatever. He says, maybe you joke too much. Maybe you goof off too much. Maybe you are lazy. Maybe you get angry too often. Maybe you exaggerate when you're telling people stories. Maybe you do, whatever it is. Why? What in you makes you do that? That's my example earlier from my friend with the guy traveling around the mountain. It's like every year, it's just the same dumb thing in my life. It just keeps coming up. But hopefully every time I come around, I'm a little better off with it. I've gotten a little bit better at it, but it's going to be that same, the shape of you is you. Right? From now to the rest of your life, you're going to still have the same shape of your character and your personality. And the flaws and the inclinations of your personality are not the same as yours and yours and yours and mine. This is where we have to be truly introspective and truly understand ourselves. I know that in my life, there's certain things that friends of mine struggle with that I don't, but I struggle with things that they don't. So, it's different. I got to pay attention to the things that I know are in. And I look in my own life, as you probably do, and I go, some of these things are just, they're personality traits. They're just the way I'm wired. And some of them were patterns that I learned, growing up, for whatever reason. Not blaming my family or anything, but just, in the environment you grew up in, nature, nurture, whatever. But whatever it is, these are the things in me that are just keep coming back. And I know that in my own life that, the only spiritual growth I'm ever going to have is to be able to not just stop doing the bad things, but start figuring out what that stuff is and start working on that stuff. Right? Chapter 13, next paragraph, or two more paragraphs here, and then we'll. It is needful to put away all inclination for useless and dangerous things. Now, this paragraph is super painful for me, personally. Okay? Because there's a lot of stuff I really enjoy doing. He says, sports, balls, plays, festivities, pomps are not in themselves evil. Oh, good. Because I sure like to play golf or whatever it is, right? But rather in different matters. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just, capable of being used for good or ill. It can be good in your life, can be some exercise, some fun, some companionship, or it can be something bad in your life. He says, but nevertheless, they are dangerous. Why are they dangerous? And it is still more dangerous to take great delight in them. Why are they dangerous? Why do you think?
They get set up as gods.
Because you can begin to love them more than God. I don't care what it is. For one person, it's their sport. For another person, it's their hobby, their hobbies, or it's this, or it's that, or it's their grandkids, it's their classic car, it's their vacations, it's their I don't know. You don't, right? But there's all this stuff to it, and none of them are bad things. Right? None of those things. Your vacations, your grandkids, your hobbies, your keeping your house clean, what's that?
Going to the gym.
Years ago, we had these neighbors, an older couple, and we would sometimes just watch them, and they had like grabber to pick up the acorns. They were super obsessed with their lawn. Like I like to have a nice lawn, and I like my neighbors to have a nice lawn, but they were like maniacally obsessed with this lawn, and they had the grabber to get the acorns. But the weird thing is, they were both older people. And he made her go get the acorns, and he would sit there with a cold drink and point out where she missed one. So this is where I guess. And so Linda and I would sit on the porch, and we would just watch this, like this slow motion train wreck. And we're like, and they were probably like in their 70s, and he's sitting on this lawn, this chair on the porch, and he's like watching her out there, and she's kind of hunched over old lady, and she's like grabbing the acorn and putting them in the bucket or whatever. And then he gets up from the chair, he walks out there, and he's like, "You missed one." And we're like, "It's gonna be amazing." Like, it was entertainment for us in the evening. So we probably loved watching it too much, right? But like, I appreciated that they wanted to have a nice lawn. But it was clear that their obsession with the lawn, which is a good thing, was clearly obsessive and compulsive and kind of weird and probably not good for them. You see where I'm going with that? Now, it's easy for me to pick on them with that story, but I've got the same kind of things in my life that I'm, right? And that's what the sales is talking about here. These are these things that become dangerous in our life because they're not bad things, but they become things that, and so he says here, look at this. I therefore say, my daughter, I say that although it is lawful to amuse yourself, to dance, dress, feast, and see seemly plays, I guess it's going to the theater. At the same time, if you are much addicted to these things, they will hinder your devotion and become extremely hurtful and dangerous to you. The harm lies not in doing them, but the degree to which you care for them. No one blames children for running after butterflies because they are children, but it is not ridiculous. Is it not ridiculous and pitiful to see full-grown men eager about such worthless trifles as the worldly amusements before named? Right? So he says it's one thing to watch kids run around and chase butterflies. It's another thing to watch full-grown men chase butterflies. And he says, like, it's not a bad thing to keep your lawn clean or to go have a hobby or to, do whatever. But like, all of these things are things that if we love them too much, we aren't loving God. Right? And so therefore, let me here, the last paragraph. Furthermore, my daughter, We have certain natural inclinations, which are not strictly speaking either mortal or venial sins, but rather imperfections in the acts which they take shape, failings and deficiencies. Some people are naturally easy, their personality, they're easygoing. Some are oppositions. In other words, some people are contrary. Some are indisposed to accept it. Right? He goes on and he goes this whole list of personality traits. Everybody's got different personality traits, and those are gonna dictate how we fall. So again, he's not laying a template that says this is what the perfect person looks like. Do this, do this, do this, avoid this, avoid this. He's saying true devotion and the devout life will be figuring out what that looks like for you. And what it looks like for you might look like different for the person next to you. Does that make sense? So it goes back to knowing yourself. Couple quick takes on that. Both having to do with Satan. Those of you who took the class I taught a couple of years ago in Dante's Divine Comedy will remember the principle of Dante and why people go to hell, or why they end up in wherever they end up, in hell or heaven or purgatory. Do you remember the principle by which Dante organized his whole Divine Comedy about where people end up and why? There's one basic principle that underlies it all. Mark, yep, Mark got it. What you love in life is what you'll do in eternity. The thing, in the end, the way we put it was, in the end, you get what you want. Right? The Rolling Stones said you don't always get what you want, whatever. And we aren't going to get what we want. Like, in the end, Dante says, you will get what you want. In the end, Dante says, I have some good news and some bad news for you. The good news is that in the end, for eternity, you'll get what you really love. The bad news is, in the end, for eternity, you'll get what you really love. And if you remember, in hell, in the layers of Inferno, everybody was getting what they really loved in life forever. And it was chilling. One other thought to end this on that spiritual warfare note. As we're reminded that the stakes of all of this, we talk an awful lot about doctrine and practice and all this stuff, but I especially during Lent, as we've been focusing on spiritual warfare and the St. Michael prayer. So over I think it was Friday, Saturday morning, I got an email from one of the listeners to the podcast. And it was a woman. She was very long email telling her story. And she had fallen to Satanism. I mean, full on Satanism. She had gone from Wicca, which is like a witchcraft religion, and she had entered into a full satanic church. And she had taken blood oaths to a patron demon, and went to the black masses and the sacred black flame or whatever. She describes this whole thing. And the good news of her story was that she had, at a certain point, she had a dream. And the dream, somebody came to her, like an angel or something, and said, go to a Catholic church. And so she called a coworker and said, you go to a Catholic church? And said, can I go with you next weekend? And she went up and introduced herself to the priest. And so she started to investigate Catholicism, and she found the podcast, and she writes how it was a huge piece for her. And she's right now in RCIA in her church, and she's getting her to the church during Easter Vigil. But she wanted to write to thank us for the podcast and what difference it made in her life. But it was a reminder that we banter about these things, but the stakes are real and eternal, and Satan is real. And as Paul says in Ephesians 6:12, we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, against rulers in high places. That's our real conflict. And so a lot of these things, we can banter about the Catholic life and banter about this, but behind all of this, and even behind those little things, like, I've been, obviously trying to make this hopefully fun and funny tonight by giving funny examples of things, but these little funny examples about this or that, or, behind those are very real eternal powers. And, when I joke about the guy with the acorn puck picker, or, the guy who wants to put dog poop on his neighbor's, porch, ha ha ha, I know I'm trying to make a funny point, but behind that is Satan and powers and principalities and rulers that will use any of these little inclinations, any of these tendencies in your life, and will encourage and fan you to follow them. And that's about resisting temptation. It's about understanding the stakes. And those of you who've read the Screw Tape Letters know that it's very small things that the tempters will use. So these little things that St. Francis of Sales is talking about tonight, these little tendencies and these personality quirks and these loves, and I really wish I had a cantaloupe thing right now, are a lot of times the gateways into your soul, into your life, that will, take you to very bad places and open the door to very bad things in your life. So we need to take that stuff real seriously.
What a testament to the Spirit too.
Yeah.
Because the seed was there.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was at least open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Recognize.
Yeah, I emailed her back on Saturday, and we had actually a little email exchange, and then I asked her permission to read her story on the show, and so I think that's going to be coming out Monday. It's really touching and really powerful, but this stuff is real, and we need to take it very seriously. And so all these things about the melon and the dog poop and the this and the that and all the things that we're joking about, I mean, I'm just trying to make it funny, or lighthearted, but these are very, very real things. And Satan doesn't care how he hooks you, how he drives you. He's happy to do it with a cantaloupe or a bag of flaming dog poop or whatever, an acorn plucker. It doesn't matter what. He's content to use anything he can to drive a wedge in your heart and to distract you from God. If you ever read the Screw Tape Letters, he talks in there about, it doesn't matter how you lead a person to hell. You can lead a person to hell, he says, by having them spend all day looking at the classified ads instead of doing their prayers. And today would be like, by scrolling Facebook instead of doing his prayers. He doesn't care. He'll get you to hell with Facebook if he can. His goal is just to distract you from God. And that's what Francis of Sales is talking about. So those are sobering things. And so I think the appropriate way to end this is with the St. Michael prayer, because it's Lent and because of that topic. So will you pray it with me? There's Son and Holy Spirit. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our defense against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly hosts, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Well, thank you, and appreciate your coming out tonight or joining us online. And we'll be back next week. Next week, we're going to be talking about prayer and the types of prayer. Francis of Sales talks about the various kinds of prayer and types and styles of prayer. Okay, so that's what we'll be into next week.